Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So, today we have a really cool task. We have a Sternberg Memory Task. So, this was actually requested from a user. A user actually, emailed us and said, hey, we'd like to see a Sternberg Memory Task. So, that's exactly what we're going to do today. And we're also going to cover two topics when making the Sternberg Memory Task that we actually get asked a lot in support. And not only do we get asked a lot this in support, but whenever we're asked this question or these questions, there's usually a lot of back and forth and even some confusion about exactly how this works. So the two things we're going to be talking about today that are of particular interest are first off, serial port communication in ePrime. I'm going to be sending signals from my Sternberg Memory Task to the to a serial port. I'm using a laptop, so I don't actually have a serial port on here, so we're going to kind of fake one, but I'll talk about how to add it to your experiment and how to implement those types of things. And also what I'm going to be talking about today is using one of our samples that we have called the study recall sample. Now, typically people will ask for this if they're doing a task like the Sternberg Memory Task, where they have a set of stimuli presented to participants, and then those exact stimuli have to be presented later, but you want that all to be random. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And typically the task is, whenever we send that sample around, it tends to be a little script dense, and it does a lot of writing to list objects via inline script. So it does require a bit of explanation. So I'm going to do this in the live stream today, just to kind of let you guys know how it's implemented and how that works. So it's going to be a really exciting live stream, and it's going to be a little bit dense. So since it's going to be a little bit of a dense live stream, what I'm going to do is today I'm only going to do one of the three conditions of the Sternberg Memory Task. But the sample that we have online, and if you are watching in our from our experiment library, the sample that should be right up there, is actually going to include all three conditions. So I'll go ahead and let you know the version of the task that I'm working from. I actually found a version of the task online from the University of South Carolina, and the version of this task actually has it kind of goes like this. So participants are going to be presented with 8 letters presented sequentially. So they're not all on the screen at the same time. They're presented in black font. Now there is going to be either 1, 3, or 5, depending on the condition, letters that are going to appear in this series of letters in green font. Now the letters in green font I'm going to ask participants to not memorize. They're supposed to ignore those. They're the distractor conditions. Now what I'm going to do, or what participants then do, is they have basically a place in the middle. We're going to call it maintenance for now. They have a maintenance period where they have to hold those letters in their mind. Now that maintenance period is going to be a randomized duration between 2 seconds and 4 seconds that they have to hold this information. And then after the randomized period of either 2 seconds or between 2 and 4 seconds, participants are then going to have a recall condition where they're going to see double the amount of letters they were supposed to memorize. So if they're supposed to memorize 7 letters, they're going to see 14 letters, and so on and so forth. And they're going to see that many letters all presented in red font. And they're going to have to decide if they've seen this letter before in the recall condition or if it is a brand new letter. So that's basically going to be our task. We're going to add some serial port communication in there as well and send some string data over to our pretend EEG, and also know that this task is going to kind of be set up with EEG in mind. So there's going to be a section for a baseline under no working memory. There's going to be a maintenance period, those types of things, because I often see this particular task not necessarily in the realm of behavioral, but more in the realm of kind of EEG studies. So keep in mind that the task is very easy to add serial port to, and the version of the sample that I'm actually going to post online isn't going to include serial port communication either. So enough talking about it, let's jump right in. So like every experiment that I've ever built, really, I'm going to go ahead and start this with a welcome object. So we'll take a text display object from our toolbox and just kind of drag it and drop it into as the first object in our session proc. And let's just go ahead and rename this one to welcome. Let's double click on it to open it in the workspace here. And I'm just going to type a very simple welcome message, just letting participants know what they'll be doing. To the task. In this task, you will be presented with several letters to memorize. If the letters appear in black font, you should memorize them. If the letters appear in green font, you should ignore them. We will begin with a simple baseline. Press space to begin. And I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this little extra period there. There we go. So just a very simple task. Participants know what they're going to be doing, that they're going to be memorizing them, and I'm going to go into instructions on how to recall them and what the recall portion of it is going to be a little while later. But right now I just want participants to focus on the fact that the next thing is going to be just a baseline, and that they will eventually be presented with a memory task. So you see here I have press space to begin as the last set of instructions on my text display object. I actually want to change that, and I'm going to change, or I don't want to change that, I want to actually edit the properties of this text display object to match that instruction. So to do that, I would take my cursor and put it in the upper left hand corner of the properties page right here. Click on the duration input tab, and I'm going to change my duration to infinite. I always like participants to read the instructions or be on the welcome screen for as much time as they need for two reasons. One, you can kind of leave this up in your lab if you don't want participants to watch you run ePrime. So this is just a good screen to sit on for a nice long while until participants read all the instructions. But two, I like to make sure that it is up for enough time for participants to read the instructions. I'll set my data logging here to standard, and I'm going to add an input mask as my response device. So I'll keyboard input mask here. So I'll click OK. Now as far as response options are concerned, I want to change my allowable from any to space in this case, because participants are going to have to press spacebar to continue. My correct answer is just going to be blank because I only have one possible key to press, so technically every answer is a correct answer. My time limit I'm going to keep the same as duration, and action of course I want terminate, and I'll just click apply and OK to save these changes. And there we go. So I'm going to close out of this window, hop back into my session proc, and the next thing I want to do is I want to make my block list. Now this block list is going to look a little different than it does in the sample. I'm going to go ahead and just rename this list object to block list. Now in the sample, this is actually where I randomize between our three possible conditions. Our one condition is going to be participants are presented with only one distractor word, or distractor letter, sorry. The other condition is participants are presented with 3 distractor letters, and the other condition is participants are presented with 5 distractor letters. It's all going to be handled up here in the block list. If you're taking a look at the sample and following along, go ahead and double click on this block list to look at it. You should see 3 levels. I'm actually just going to focus on only one of them because basically it turns into a lot of copying and pasting after I make my first procedure. And if you see the sample, you'll kind of know, or you'll kind of notice that, like, hey, everything looks similar after a certain point. We only adjust 1 or 2 little things, and it doesn't actually make for good live streaming. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this procedure right now just to 1 block proc, just to maintain consistency between this and the sample. This sample, or this portion of the block list, is actually meant to present participants with the condition with 1 distractor letter. It doesn't exist. We'd like to create it, yes. And we'd like to make the default value of newly created levels at the block level. Generally, as a rule of thumb, at the block level, let's go ahead and select no to this prompt and hop back into the block list. Now, what I did in the sample, and what you can see if you're opening the sample, is I actually have 2 other levels here, one for my 3 distractor condition and one for my 5 distractor condition. And then what I did is I went into this properties page here, and in the selection tab I set it from sequential to random. And I actually just randomly presented one of these, or all of these 3 conditions, but that way participants don't always get 1 distractor, 3 distractors, 5 distractors. It all gets mixed up. So they are presented with all 3 conditions, but they're presented in a random order based on participant. But it's not what we're doing in this version of the task, so I'm going to go ahead and delete these 2. And we'll jump into our 1 block proc. Now this setup is going to be a little bit different because basically that block proc is going to act as, this is controlling all of the different conditions of the experiment. So we need to actually build all of the conditions of the experiment. And what we're going to end up with here is we're going to end up with kind of a little bit of extra stuff in here, because usually if you follow along with my webinars, what I do is I have my block list and then I jump right into my trial list. But there's a couple things we need before the trial list. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is just make that baseline object that I had talked about earlier. And I'm going to take a text display object and put it as the first item in my 1 block proc. Now the study that I read said that the baseline proc was about 5 seconds long, and it was just a simple plus sign in the middle of the screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename this one to baseline. All right, so we have a few people in chat. Good morning, guys. Go ahead and double click on this baseline to open it in our workspace. And I'm just going to go ahead and click on this plus sign here, or just type a plus sign. So like I said, like I always say in these text display objects, yes, it appears at the top, but that's not the way it's going to appear at runtime. You can hop into the properties page here and check out the align horizontal and align vertical property to see where this little plus sign is ultimately going to end up. It says center and center, so it's obviously going to appear in the very middle of the screen. Let's go on over to duration input, because this is really the only property we need to change, or the only tab we need to change properties on. And I need to set this to 5 seconds, so I'll set it to 5,000 milliseconds. Change my data logging in this case to standard, and what I'm actually going to do is just not add an input mask. I don't want a case where a participant just kind of hits through my baseline, because that's going to be important for me. I need some data as to where the participant is without any cognitive load. So I want to go ahead and click apply and OK. And that's all I need to do to the baseline. It's probably the easiest object in the entire experiment. So go ahead and close out of all of these and open up my one block proc again. And I'm going to make one more text display object, and this object is just going to be called begin block. Now this is going to let participants know that our baseline data collection is over. It's going to let them know that now we're going to present the memorization condition, and just to remind them of our memorization rules again, because it has been a little while. I mean, exactly 5 seconds, so why not remind them one more time? So I'll call this one begin block. I'll double click on this to open it. Now, what I'm going to do is just write a very simple message. The edits for this are honestly going to be identical to the welcome screen. So I'm just going to say, thank you very much for resting during the baseline data collection. You will now be presented with the letters to memorize. Remember, if the letter appears in black font, you need to memorize it. If the letter appears in green font, you need to ignore it. And then press space to begin. There we go. All right, and I realize I'm kind of overlapping some of that text there. I'll go ahead and pop those windows out for you so you can see more of that text. There you go. So, thank you very much for resting during the baseline data collection. You will now be presented with letters to memorize. Remember, if the letter appears in black font, you need to memorize it. If the letter appears in green font, you need to ignore it. Press space to begin. So all we need to do is the exact same edits to that welcome screen. So we'll click on that properties page icon, click on duration input. We'll change our duration to infinite, change our data logging to standard, and we'll go ahead and add a keyboard input device, and we'll go ahead and change this allowable any to space. And then click apply and OK once you're done. And that's all you need to do. Now we have our begin block already made. All right, so earlier I had mentioned that a very important part of this script here is going to be that, or a very important part of the task is that they're going to have a maintenance period of between 2 to 4 seconds. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this in ePrime. The one way would be to have a list object with a long list of all of the possible durations for this object and just have it referenced as an attribute. But there is a function in ePrime script that I really, really like that we're going to use today, and that function is called the random function. Now, what the random function does is you give it a lower limit and you give it an upper limit, and then it randomly picks a time or picks a number in between that upper and lower limit. And that's what we're going to do to get our random duration, because at that point it's actually going to be a truly random duration. It's not going to be a nice, neat, like tenths of milliseconds like I would do, or hundredths of milliseconds, probably realistically like what I would do. But it's actually going to be just a random number. So to use that random function, you need to write a little bit of inline script. And a little bit of warning today, there's going to be some inline script, but it's very user-friendly inline script, I promise. And it's actually pretty easy for me to explain all of the inline script we'll be doing, so I'll be explaining all the script kind of a lot. So after our begin block, let's go ahead and take an inline object and put it just after our begin block. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this inline object just to set ISI. ISI, interstimulus interval, obviously. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this to open it in the workspace. Now, for those of you new to inline objects, they're really blank. They're literally just like for lack of a better term, a blank canvas for you to write on. But it's just a script editor, and ePrime will basically do whatever functions or commands that you put in here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm first going to create a variable. Now, to create a variable in ePrime, you have to use something called the dim statement. So it's basically just declaring a variable. So it's letting ePrime know, hey, I'm going to make a new variable in ePrime. And I'm just going to call this one random ISI. And I'm going to set it to long. Now, long is a native data type, or a data type that's native to Visual Basic for applications, and basically its purpose is just to hold the value of a large number. So for those of you who are used to maybe algebra or something like that, where x ends up equaling something in the end, and that's kind of the point of it, this word random ISI is going to represent a number in our script, and we're going to use it in a couple of different ways. So we have our random ISI now. Now we have to actually set it to something. So we have to give it some sort of value, because right now it's currently set to 0, because whenever you define a long, so whenever I go ahead and define this data type as long, it is automatically set to 0. So if I were to check out how much it's worth right now, it's worth 0, and obviously we don't want that. So to give it a value, what we have to do is type its name. So I'll do random ISI equals, and now we're going to do that random function that I was gushing about a little bit earlier. So to do that, I just type the word random, and you can see that ePrime script sense turns it gray. That means that it's basically a special term in ePrime. Like, for example, I wouldn't want to define a variable called random, because random is a function in ePrime, so it already kind of has a task to do or a job to do, and I don't want to overload that. So I would type the word random, and then now I need to put in the lower bound and the upper bound of my randomization. So the lower bound is going to be 2,000 milliseconds, or 2 seconds, and my upper bound, which is just separated by a comma, is going to be 4,000 milliseconds, or 4 seconds. So now this random ISI object that I have here is going to be set to a completely random number between 2,000 and 4,000, which is what's going to represent how long the maintenance period is for each trial. So right now I have this set here. So now I have to use it in ePrime, because basically, if you remember back when we were editing our welcome or our baseline, there's that duration property. I need to set that to the duration property. Now I could set it just by directly referencing an object that I don't have yet, and just setting its duration in inline script. That is a possibility, but I actually want to set it to the attribute name, or to an attribute in ePrime. Now the reason I'm setting it to an attribute instead of directly referencing the property is because if I set it to an attribute, it also gets saved in my data file, and it gets saved as random ISI or whatever I decide to call it. So I do want that to show up in my data file eventually, because I want to see if that might be, in my data analysis, maybe it's a possible covariate for task performance or something like that. So it's always good to save this kind of information. So in order to make it an attribute that I can reference later in ePrime, what I would do is I would do the c.setAttrib statement. So basically what this is saying is this little c here stands for context, and context just means at this level of the experiment, and setAttrib means I'm making a new attribute or modifying an existing one. So c.setAttrib, and then the name of the attribute that you want is going to end up being the title of the column in your edat file. So what do I want the column in my edat file to say? In this case, I want it to be called random ISI. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't necessarily need to match what the variable name is. In this case, I just like the name that I came up with. I'm particularly proud of it, so I want to keep that same thing. And then I type a comma. Now everything after this comma is what's going to fill in the actual cells of my data file, and what ePrime is going to reference whenever it picks what the random ISI is going to be. So in this case, everything afterwards, I just want it to be whatever value ePrime picked for this random ISI variable. So to do that, all I have to do is copy random ISI here, and then paste it just after this. So I'm actually doing 3 things with this random ISI variable. The first thing I'm doing is I'm defining it as a long variable type. I'm then giving it a value and setting it to a random number between 2,000 and 4,000, and then I'm taking that value and making an entirely new attribute called random ISI and setting this value, or the value of this attribute, to the random number that ePrime picked. So that's all I have to do now to get a random duration. So what I'm going to do then is reference that a little later. Now, of course, there's a couple steps between now and referencing it, but we'll come back to this. All right, so I'm going to hop over to my one block proc again. And this is the last thing that I need before I actually start getting into the memorize trial list. So let's go ahead and take the list object, or take a list object and put it just after my set ISI. And I'm just going to call this one memorize trial list. Now the purpose of my memorize trial list is to present those letters to participants, and it's going to present two types of letters. It's going to present either a black letter that they're to memorize or a green letter that they're not supposed to memorize. So I'll go ahead and double click on this. Now my procedure here is just going to be called memorization proc. And hit enter. It doesn't exist, but I like to create it. Yes. Would I like to make it the default value for newly created levels? I'm also going to click yes. So now, whenever I make a procedure, because I clicked yes, you can see that it's going to fill itself in with memorization proc there. Now, the study that I was working on gave participants a set of 8 letters. And in this condition, 7 of those letters are letters they were supposed to memorize, and 1 of those letters was something they weren't supposed to memorize. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make 8 levels here. Now I can do that either by clicking on the Add Level button in the upper left-hand corner and adding some more levels, or I can click on the Add Multiple Levels button and only add 5 of them. And now I have 8. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make another attribute. So this is very similar to making this in script. This is going to show up as a column in this list object, but it's also going to show up in my data file, which is pretty nice. And I'm going to call this attribute stim letter. There we go. Now my stim letter, according to the study that I have, was nothing but consonants. So I am just going to pick the consonants just in the rows of the keyboard from top to bottom. Keep in mind that these are going to be set to random selection eventually, so people aren't actually going to see the Q, W, R, T, and you know what? Y is sometimes a vowel. It's going to sometimes be a consonant today. Oops. And I'm just going to keep these all capitalized. Now it's S, and then we have D. There we go. So these are our stim letters. Then what I want to do is I want to actually randomize the stim letter presentation. I don't want participants to get all of these in this order because eventually they might start catching on, oh hey, I can kind of guess the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this properties page icon, click on my selection tab here, and set my order to random. And then click apply and OK. So now ePrime is going to randomly present these letters. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to decide which one of these letters is going to be something that they're not supposed to memorize. Now I really have 2 options here. The first one, and the easiest one, is for me to add an attribute here called stim color and to literally tie a single letter to that stim color. So that means, for example, if I choose a stim color for R as green, that means no participant is ever going to have to memorize the letter R. They're all going to have to memorize the other letters. I don't really like that. That may end up being a confound in the study for whatever reason. So what I want to do is I want to randomize which of my pool of letters participants are going to memorize or not. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a nested list, and I'm going to call this color 1 list. It says color 1 list does not exist. Really, to create it, of course I would, and I'm just going to add my nested list to every single level here. That way, every trial that the participants run has access to this same nested list, which is exactly what I want. Now I'm going to go into my color 1 list, and I'm just going to add one more level here because I have 2 different conditions. I have one condition where the word is black and one condition where the word is green. And I'm going to actually add 2 attributes here. Now, if you just add multiple attributes by clicking add multiple attributes and then typing a number, it just calls them attribute 1 and attribute 2 and doesn't give you a chance to rename them. To rename the attributes, all you do is double click on the word attribute 1 at the top or attribute 2, and then you can edit the name there. So I'm going to call this one stim color because this is going to represent the color of each of my stimuli, and I'm going to call this one, what do I want to call this one? I want to call this one save for recall. Sorry, I have my cheat sheet over there I'm looking at. Save for recall. There we go. So this is going to let me know whether or not participants are supposed to memorize this. And this works out because E prime reads each and every procedure one row at a time. So if I make my stim color black, my save for recall is of course going to be yes. If I make my stim color green, my save for recall is going to be no. So now there's really two more edits I need to do. First, I need to make this random selection because I don't want this to be the same trials as, the same red and or black and green trials. So I want to click on selection and change my order here to random. Now the only other edit I need to do, and this is actually a really important one, is I need to change this weight or these weight columns here, because right now I only have 2 samples here. So what's going to happen is whenever participants run this experiment, one letter from this list here is going to be green, the other one's going to be red, then the next is going to be green, then the next is going to be red. And that's actually going to, because I have 8 trials here, that's going to result in 4 don't memorize these trials and 4 do memorize these trials, and when in actuality I only want 1 trial set for memorization. So what I need to do then is I need to change my weight here from 1 to 7 for the black trials, so I have 7 black memorized trials and 1 green do not memorize trial. And since this is random and this is random, each participant is going to randomly get a different letter that they're not supposed to memorize. And that's honestly really all I need to do in this list object. I want to do that's it. That's all I need to do in these list objects. So let's go ahead and jump into the memorization proc and actually make just the different parts of the memorization task. And this one's actually going to be pretty easy. I'm going to take a slide object and I'm going to put it as the first object in my memorization proc here. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to Stim display. I'm kind of trying to keep the naming consistent among everything. Anything that interacts with the stimuli that participants are going to be seeing or going to be memorizing, I'm trying to use the prefix stim and then exactly what it does. This is going to make my data analysis a lot easier, particularly because I then kind of know the function of each and every one of my objects. I know I haven't really said this in a while in a lot of my live streams, but my mantra when naming E objects is always that the name needs to reflect the function of the E object. And since this is going to be used to display my stimuli, I'll call it Stim display. Alright, so I'm going to take a text display object and I'm going to put it in the very center of the screen here. Now, I try for very center. I'm probably off a little bit. To check if you are off, go ahead and click on this sub-object properties page icon at the top of the screen here. And if I go over to the frame tab, this lets me know where this is in relation to the screen, and I was so close. I set it to 49% and 44%. If I want it to be in the middle of the screen, all I need to do is change this X property to center and change the Y property to center as well. And if I click apply, you can see by how much I was off. I was so close. Now, the other important thing that I need to change while I'm in here, I need to make 2 big changes. The first big change I'm actually not going to make in here, but the second one I am. So I need to change this forecolor property. Now the forecolor property reflects the color of the font of anything in this text display object or a slide text sub-object. So right now it's currently set to black, but if you recall, I'm actually changing that on a per trial basis using an attribute called Stim color. So I'm going to just reference my Stim color attribute here. And if you do a correct attribute reference, so just correctly formatted, which means it has a square bracket in the beginning and the end of the forecolor property, you're going to notice it turn blue. That means that E prime is looking somewhere else for this value, so it's going to get either green or black depending on the trial. So I'll click apply and OK. And then I wanted to change the actual text of this from the word text to that Stim color attribute, or that Stim letter attribute that I had made earlier. And I wanted to do this here because if you click on a left bracket to begin an attribute reference on a slide text sub-object, you get a trib sense, which is one of my favorite properties. I gush about it kind of a lot actually. And I want to change this to Stim letter. And if you look here, it says Stim letter is defined in memorized trial list, which is a list item. So I will click on it and it makes a pre-formatted awesome attribute reference for me right there. I don't need to do anything else. Now, this Stim display is actually a pretty simple object, actually. All it needs to do is just show a letter once every, 2 seconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my properties page here, and I'm going to go over to my duration input tab. Again, really the only tab I need to change. I'm just going to change my duration to 2000 milliseconds, and I'll change my data logging to standard, and that's it. I don't want to click on, or I don't want to add an input mask because I don't want participants to be forwarding through this, and I want to know that each participant had the exact same amount of time to look at each letter. That way it'll be easier to analyze all of my data, especially if I'm integrating with EEG later. So I'll click Apply and OK to save these changes. Alright, and that's all I need for Stim display. So now we're actually going to make just a little bit more inline script. Now, the reason that we're going to be doing this inline script is because if you notice I have my memorized trial list here, and I'm picking a random letter to be displayed or for participants not to memorize. Now that creates a bit of a problem once I get into my recall list, because if I'm randomly picking a letter from this and don't know what letter participants are going to be memorizing, then I actually don't know how to format my recall list, because I don't know what letter is going to not be randomized, so I don't want to show a letter that I already said, hey, don't memorize. So all I need to do is make a little inline object, and this is where that study recall sample that I had mentioned earlier comes into play, where I want to make an inline object that takes a look at this attribute right here, save for recall. And every time that attribute's set to yes, I then want it to be a part of my recall list, to actually populate items in a recall list. And I'm going to show you how that works, because it's honestly, I really think it's cool. And if it's ever set to no, I want it to just ignore it, and I don't want it to show up in my recall list. This is going to make your program so much more adaptive whenever you make it this way, because if you make it this way, you can have all of these random variables and everything constantly changing, and EEPROM's just going to be like, okay, I know that we're not presenting this, I don't need to keep it for later. And you know, it just makes it much more consistent, honestly makes it easier to program later. So after my Stim display, I'm just going to add an inline object here. And I'm going to call this inline object mark as sampled. Now, if you've used the study recall sample, this is going to look extremely familiar. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a bit of an if-then statement. So the if-then statement really only applies to if I am to all the conditions that I have marked save for recall. So I need to gain access to that attribute reference. So I will say if c.getAttrib, and this getAttrib statement actually just takes a look at one of the attributes either in your list object or in an inline object, and it just says, okay, what is its current value? And you know that it's current value because of this C part of the statement. I know that we have a getCurrentAttrib property as well. It's actually not needed if you're just getting what the attribute is at this point in time. So if I do that c.getAttrib statement and then do a left bracket, you'll see that my attrib sense pops up one more time, and it actually pops up in script, and all I have to do is just find my save for recall attribute, click on it, and then hit enter, or double click on it if you want, and now I have a perfectly good, or a perfectly formatted c.getAttrib statement, which is something else that I really like. Is EEPROM really tries to help you out with the scripting if you're new to it. So if c.getAttrib save for recall equals yes. So if this value is ever set to yes, that means I'm supposed to be saving it for recall. Then I want a whole bunch of other stuff to happen. Now I need to set a variable here that's just going to act as a counter. It's just going to increment every single time that I have a new item to save for recall. And this is going to be really important a little while later. So I'm just going to set this counter variable equal to itself plus 1. Now if you noticed, and we're following along with my set ISI inline object, you'll notice I actually skipped 2 steps. The first step is I didn't define this variable. So if I were to check my syntax by clicking on this compile button or this generate button here, EEPROM is actually going to give me a bit of an error, and I'll show you that quick. So in order to compile an experiment, I'm going to click on save as, and you have to actually save it somewhere. So I'm going to save this in my Sternberg Memory Task. And I'll just save it in this folder here just as Sternberg Memory Task. So this saves it, and if you're completely new to writing script and want to make sure that syntactically you're not making any errors, or even if you're a pro at script and want to make sure you're syntactically not making any errors, don't get me wrong, I use this function all the time. Click on the generate button, and any errors you're making, you're going to get. So I have this error here that says variable not defined. And what that error means, and even if you run into it at your in your own experiments, it'll highlight it exactly where the error is happening. And if you look in the debug tab here, it says line 609 or 690, that's actually in the full script, column 2. And it actually says error occurred at line number 2 of inline mark as sampled. So there's line number 2 in inline mark as sampled, column 2, which just means I am one indent into this. First character is a tab, second character is this. So it happened right away, and it just says variable not defined. And all that means is that I'm missing that dim statement. Now, whenever I define a variable, it actually defines it and sets it right away. And I had mentioned earlier in my set ISI, when I defined that variable as a long, it automatically set it as 0. Now, if I do that here and do a dim statement to define my variable here, it's going to set it to 0 on every single trial, and it's never going to get past 1, because it'll define it and set it as 1, or define it, and then it'll set it as 1 here, and then it'll reset it back to 0 and then set it to 1 here every single time it encounters a script. So I want this to actively be growing and growing. So to do that, what I need to do is hop into my user script. Now, user script is where I define global variables. So global variables are defined as variables, such as my counter variable here, that can be accessed by every level of my experiment. And this is actually going to be referenced on a couple of levels, which is why I want it to be a global variable. So if I do dim counter as long, and I keep that there, I'm going to go ahead and regenerate my experiment, and I'm going to get a completely different error. And that's because I didn't finish my if-then statement. But if you notice, e' is now happy with my counter variable. Now, what I want to do before I continue with this with this counter variable, is I want to go ahead into my set ISI object, and I just want to say very quickly that counter equals 0. Because every time e' is going to run into the set ISI list, I want to reset that counter. And that's going to be really, really important for when I eventually scale up this experiment. So know that while this isn't as necessary right now, because technically it's setting it to 0 when I have my, or in the full script or in the user script right there, like technically this is setting it to 0. However, since I'm setting it to 0 here, that means that every time I have a new condition, I'm going to reset this. And that's exactly what I want. Alright, so now that I made that counter variable and set it, I need to actually use it. So what I'm going to do is, if my save for recall is yes, I need to actually start filling in my recall list. Now, my recall list doesn't exist. I don't actually have it yet. So I'm going to just write the script for it, and then we'll go ahead and make the list object itself. So I'm going to say recall trial list dot setAttrib. Now, if you notice, I did a setAttrib earlier for making a new variable, and I used C instead of any specific list object. That's because I just wanted that set at its current object, or at its current state. If I use this recall trial list, or in this case I'm referencing a name of a list directly, what I'm then telling e' is basically I'm editing a list object, and I'm editing the values of a particular row and column in a list object. And e' needs to have some of some of that information. So the first piece of information that the list object.setAttrib requires is what level of the list object that you're editing. Now, when I say level, I mean what is the ID here. So e' first goes, okay, I'm editing a list object. What level do I want to make an edit at? And in this case, I'm going to just sequentially use that counter variable that I had set to work my way through different levels of the list object. So I'm just going to put counter here, because what this is going to do is on trial 1, it's going to edit this row 1. On trial 2, it'll edit row 2, trial 3, edit row 3, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to hop back into my inline object. It seems like I lost it. If you ever lose your window in a mess like this, you can click on window and then find what you want here. So I want that mark as sampled inline, and it'll pop it right up for you. So the first piece of information was the row that I need. Then I need a comma, and then I need to tell e' exactly what column I'm referencing. And the column in this case is going to be called stim letter. And then the final piece of information is what am I putting in that cell. So if I look at my memorize list, for example, because my recall list is going to look very simple, which is why, look very similar, which is why I keep referencing this memorize trial list. So first, I'm telling e' look at row 1, or whatever my counter is currently set to, then look at the stim letter column, so then E prime knows, okay, I'm looking at this specific cell, then afterwards, what am I putting in that cell? And I'm actually going to put in that cell the letter that's being displayed on the screen right now. Because if recall list is, or save for recall is set to yes, that means this letter needs to be ported over into my recall list. So I'm going to just do c.getAttrib and just stim letter. So that means the C, or the using C here, just means that I'm not referencing the stim letter in my eventual recall list. I'm referencing the stim letter in the current memorized trial list. So that's really all I need to do there to set that. And then I just need to do an end if statement. So now E prime is going to adapt itself. Every time a green object appears on the screen, it's going to say, I don't need this. And every time a black object appears on the screen, it goes, I need this. I'm going to put this into my recall list. So quite obviously, what we need next is a recall list. So let's go ahead and close all of these windows, because as you can see, I have kind of a lot open. Hop into one block proc, and I'm going to take a list object and put it just after my memorized trial list. And I'm just going to rename this one to recall trial list. Now I'm calling this one recall trial list because in my mark as sampled inline object, I'm referencing a list called recall trial list. Note that this part of this script, this part of the script needs to match the name of a list object exactly. If it doesn't, you're going to get an error on this line of script here. So I'll go to my recall trial list, and I'm just going to call this one recall proc. It doesn't exist. If you'd like to create it, I'm going to click yes. Would I like to make it the default value for newly created levels? Again, I'm going to click yes. So I'll open up my recall trial list here, and I'm going to add an attribute called stim letter. Now I'm adding that one because if you remember back to the mark as sampled inline object here, I am looking at this recall trial list, c.setAttrib counter, which is just the number of the row, and then specifically stim letter. So that better be there or I'm going to get another error. Now, the way that the task that I'm kind of basing mine off of presented the recall portion is that it is a 50-50 split. There is going to be X number of critical trials or trials where the probe that I'm going to be displaying matches a memorized letter, and there is going to be a 50% probability of entirely new letters showing up that are kind of that aren't memorized or shouldn't have been memorized. Now, this is where a little bit of math comes in, but not difficult math. So if I look in my memorized trial list here, I'm only memorizing 7 of the 8 stimuli. I'm memorizing 7 of the 8 stimuli because I have one list that's going to end up one object is going to end up being green. So that means in order for me to successfully use this mark as sampled script, this counter variable is going to go up to 7 because there are 7 letters that are going to be memorized here. So I need 7 rows here in my list object. Then, since the task has me do a 50-50 split, I need to add an additional 7 rows for letters that have not been used and will not be used or participants will not have memorized. So I'm going to click add multiple levels, and I'm going to add 7. So now I have 14, so now it's that 50-50 split. So the way that this list object is going to have to be set up is I'm going to keep the stim letter set to question mark for the first 7 trials. And I'm keeping them to question mark for the first 7 trials because my mark as sampled inline object is actually going to be overwriting these question marks, and it'll be filling an entirely new value, so I don't even need to worry about them. What I need to worry about is all of the other letters. So I just need to make sure I'm going to fill in the remaining 7, so 8 through 14, just with other random consonants there. There we go, and I'm going to do a quick check of my memorized trials just to make sure I didn't overlap those, because honestly there's nothing worse than overlapping these and presenting participants with a letter that they are not supposed, or they were supposed to memorize, but you messed it up, because I actually did that when making this task. So now I want to make sure I don't. Alright, so these are going to be programmatically filled in by E prime. These are going to be my distractor letters. Now, participants are going to have to press either 1 or 2 on the keyboard in order to memorize, or in order to say that this is a memorization trial. So I want to go ahead and click on Add Attribute and just make a correct response attribute. And for all of the ones that they have memorized, I need to type in a 1 there. And for all of the ones that they haven't, I need to type a 2. And I want to, of course, change my selection here to random. And that's really all I need to do as far as the editing of the list object is concerned. But I need to do one last thing to this list object. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump back into my one block proc, and I'm going to add an inline object just before my recall trial list. And I'm just going to rename this one to set recall list. And this is one of the easier things to kind of overlook in ePrime sometimes when messing around with all of these list objects. And the thing that I want to add here is just a very simple bit of inline script that says recall trial list dot reset. And that's all this inline needs to have. Now the reason for this script is because it's like hitting the apply button on the list object, because in this mark is sampled inline object, I do a lot of changes to the recall list. Now if I were to just run this without this inline script, this list object wouldn't be changed at all. It would actually just stay the way it was with all of these question marks, even though I did all of this writing to it. Doing this recall trial list dot reset property just is like saying, okay, I'm applying all the changes I made to the list before it runs. So just think of the script as hitting the apply button, and you're honestly 90% of the way there. So I'm going to close all of this. I'm going to go into my recall proc, and this is actually just going to be very simple. All I need to do is take a slide object. I want to rename this slide object just to probe display. I'm going to hit enter here. I'm going to add a very simple text display. This is honestly going to look very similar to my Stim display earlier. I'm going to reference Stim letter. I'm going to make sure this object appears in the very center of the screen. Ow, so close. I can usually get pretty close. I've never been perfect on this yet. And the other thing I need to change is just to line up with the study that I'm going off of here. The fore color here needs to be red. So all of my presentation, or all of my probes here, should be red. And then I want to go to the properties page of the entire slide object. And this is another thing that's kind of easy for beginners of ePrime to mess up, is there are two properties page icons here. This properties page icon will show you the properties for whatever's showing up in this pane right here. So either the slide state or the text display object. This properties page here is going to give you the properties for the entire thing. So for every single, or for the entirety of the slide object. So I'm going to click on this duration input tab. I'm going to set my duration here to infinite. The study didn't actually define how long this was on the screen, so feel free to change this if your study dictates that this should be a different duration. I'm going to change my data logging to standard. I'm going to add a keyboard input device. Participants are only supposed to press 1 or 2 on the keyboard, so I'm going to set my allowable to 1, 2. And my correct is going to be just correct response, because this is going to change on a per trial basis, so I need to just reference this with my attribute reference. Click apply and OK to save these changes. And that's all I need. That is the entirety of my recall list. So now the letters are going to appear one after the other for participants, and they're going to just say, yes, I've seen this, no, I haven't seen this, and so on. So that's really the bones of what this sample is. There's a couple of things that I want to add to this to make it a little easier though, and a little more obvious to participants what they're doing, because if it just kind of runs straight through, participants know that they have their baseline, they know that they're supposed to start to study all these letters, but there's nothing to let them know that the study portion's over. And actually, more specifically, I didn't end up using this random ISI yet, so let's go ahead and use that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my one block proc one more time. And at the end of this, I want to just have a text display object just between this set recall list and this memorized trial list, and I'm just going to call this one maintenance. And I'm going to go ahead and double click on it to open it in the workspace. Now the study that I was going off of said that maintenance was actually just this line in the middle of the screen. That's all my maintenance period is going to be. And if you recall, the maintenance period is going to be between 2 seconds and 4 seconds. So to give it that value, I need to reference that attribute that I set in my set ISI. So this is called random ISI. So I will go into my maintenance object, click on the properties page in the upper left hand corner, go to my duration input tab, and for duration, instead of 1000, I just want to set this to random ISI. And then I'll of course set my data logging to standard, but that's really all I need. I don't want participants to have to exit early out of this task or out of this part of the study. So I'm not going to put an input mask. I'm just going to set my duration, set data logging, and I'm done. Now the only other thing I want to add here is participants don't really have much direction as to what they're going to press or what they're even supposed to do during the recall period. So I need to actually add another text display object just after my maintenance period. And I'm just going to call this one begin recall. I'll go ahead and double click on it to check out its properties. And I'm just going to say this concludes the study, the memorization portion of this task. We will now move on to the recall portion of the task. If you see a letter that you were asked to memorize, press 1 on the keyboard. You see a letter that you were not asked to memorize, press 2 on the keyboard. Press space to begin. There we go. So just very simple instructions about what they're going to be doing here. And we'll click on this properties page icon, click on the duration input tab. I'll change my duration to infinite, my data logging to standard, and I'll add a keyboard input device or set it to space here. And click apply and OK, and that's all I need to change. Alright, so now that I have all that set up, the very last thing that I like to do when building my experiments is just make a goodbye object. So I'll take a text display object and add it to just after block list. Go ahead and rename this one to feedback display. Feedback display. Rename it to goodbye. Sorry about that. Go ahead and rename my goodbye object, or edit the properties of my goodbye object, just to say thank you very much. Completing this study. Please let the researcher know you are done. That's all I need. Just a very simple text just letting them know that they're done. All right. So that is how you make one part of a Sternberg memory task. Now, if you were to expand this to have the 3 condition and the 5 condition, all it would do is just add those levels to my block list like I had mentioned earlier, and just very little tweaks to each list object. So clearly my color list, I would change the weights from 7 to 1 to 5 to 3 to, 5 to 3 the other way. I would just need to make a tweak there, and then that would literally just change what my recall list looked like a little bit, because right now it's 14 trials, but if I have 5 I'm supposed to ignore and 5 I'm supposed to memorize, it'll change it to 5 and 5, so on and so forth. But those changes are honestly very simple, and if anybody has questions about those changes, feel free to submit a support ticket, because I'm always happy to go into that a little more. But the one thing I do want to talk about is adding serial port communication to this task. So adding serial port communications task is actually really, really easy, especially how we've set this experiment up. It lends itself very nicely to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my experiment object here, and I'm going to hop into the devices tab. Now, the devices tab just tells your computer, or tells ePrime, all of the different aspects of the computer that you're going to be using in this task. So for example, we're currently using the display and the keyboard for all of our responses. We technically don't need the mouse device. And we really don't need the sound device because we're not playing any sound, but we'll keep them just in case. But I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to add a serial port. Now, go ahead and double click on the serial port to check out its properties. The most important property to change about the serial port is this COM port property. Now, the COM port is how you're actually referencing the port object in ePrime and how you're telling ePrime, hey, this is what we're looking for. So the COM port is currently set to 1 by default, but you need to actually take a look at the serial port on your computer and just see how it's being referenced. You can find out what the correct COM number is by clicking on Tools and selecting Windows Device Manager. Now, Windows Device Manager isn't actually an ePrime thing. It's a Windows thing. We just have a shortcut to it. And I am using a laptop that doesn't have this information on it or have a serial port. But if you are using one, there'll be a listing here called ports com/LPT. And if you click on that, there'll be the word com with a number next to it. That is what you need to set under this serial device right here under com port. You need to set that number that follows the word com. I'm going to keep it at 1 for now just because I don't have one and I just need a serial port in here. So now that I've added my serial port, I need to tell it to start sending some things. So I'm going to go ahead and hop into my Stim display, and I'm going to go to my properties page and click on task events. Now this task events tab allows me to time lock an event in ePrime with a code or a signal that I'm sending to an external device. And with ePrime 3, it actually allows me to time lock script with this, which is going to be really cool. So I'm actually, in this case, just going to add my Stim display.onset time. So as soon as this is displayed, I want to know what letter participants are seeing. So I'm going to choose a task, and I'm going to click on serial, because I'm going to be sending information through my serial port, and I'm going to be sending a string's worth of information. And now I want to get 2 pieces of information across my serial port. The first piece of information that I want to add is whether or not it is a memorize or not memorize condition, and is in what the letter itself is. So I want 2 pieces of information here. I want the Stim color, and I want my Stim letter. So now what I'm going to get across my my serial port is I'm going to get either red I'm going to get either black or green, and then I'm going to get the letter that was presented. That way I know, or I can check out in my participant's brain activity exactly what they were not thinking, but what their brainwaves were doing whenever the Stim color was green. So whenever they had that don't memorize condition, is there a change in their brainwave patterns at all? And my data type is of course going to be string. So that's really the only thing I need to do there. And then I want something here in my baseline. So I just want a quick signal for when baseline started and when baseline ended. So I'm going to go into task events. I'm going to add an onset time task event for the serial port again. And I'm just going to use write string. And my string is just going to be baseline begin. And my data type will be string. That way I have a signal whenever my baseline began, and I want another one when it ends. Now, a common mistake that a lot of people make is they do baseline ends, or they do the offset time, or they do the end call at the offset time of the object. And this is a mistake because if you go into the duration input tab, you're going to see here that the duration is set to 5,000 milliseconds, and my pre-release is set to same as duration. Now, in ePrime's terms, what that means is that it's going to view the dot offset time, or log the dot offset time, as the almost same millisecond as the dot onset time, because whenever it presents it for 5,000 milliseconds in the background, because of this pre-release property, it's actually working on other stuff. So we actually don't want to have the dot offset time be the end of the baseline. We want the dot offset, or we want the end of the baseline to be the onset time of my begin block. And this is going to be the most accurate representation of how long that baseline happened, because technically when this begin block text display object is on the screen, the baseline object is off the screen. So that's why I kind of view that as the most accurate representation of when my baseline ended. So I'm going to click on this properties page icon, click on task events. I'm going to add a .onset time task event, add a serial port, and I'm going to just write string one more time, and this is going to be baseline end. Just applying OK to save that change. And then finally what I want to do is I want to add something to maintenance and then to my probe display. So for maintenance, I want to do something very similar here. I want an onset time task event. I want to add a serial port. And I want to write string, and this string is just going to be maintenance begin. There we go. My data type will be string here. And then in my begin recall, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the exact same reason. At my .onset, I'm just going to call this one maintenance end. And that'll be another string. Maintenance end, and data type will be string. And finally, I just want one on my probe display. So I'll double click on my probe display here to open it. Click on the properties page, click task event, click add, and this is just going to be on set time. And we'll do serial port, I'll do write string, and then what I want is probe, and then a stim letter, or a reference to my stim letter attribute. So now I have probe and a reference to my stim letter attribute, so it'll be, probe X, probe J, whatever it is. That way I know what probe they're looking at and can see, oh, this is a memorization one or not. And I'll change my data type here to string. And that's all I need to enable serial port communication in a task like this. Keep in mind that the serial port communication isn't necessarily a part of the sample that I'm going to include or that's going to be in the experiment library. It's just something that I added to this just to this webinar because I know that that's something that a lot of people are going to want to do with this task. So it'll be a good job of showing you how to implement this once you already have the baseline sample. But that's all of the information I have for you guys today. Thank you very much for watching. If you guys have any questions, feel free to either leave a comment for me. I'm always happy to answer the comments. Or go to support.pstnet.com and submit a support ticket. Say, hey, I've been watching this video with Devon. I have these questions about the Sternberg Memory Task, and I'm always happy to explain a little bit more about the task. I'm happy to let you know if you need to edit anything about the task itself and you want it to kind of grow or shift in any specific way, or you're doing a modified version of this task. Let me know. I'm always happy to help. As always, like and subscribe to our channel so I can keep making more of these videos. I actually just released a pretty cool set of videos too last Tuesday. It's called my Tour Of series, and if you were kind of following along today and you were like, well, how does he know to go here for this, or how did he know that I can get to the Windows Device Manager under the Tools properties? I actually walk you through each and every one of the properties in eStudio, and I also have a video on each separate e-object that I used here. So how did I know that I needed a text display object, or how did I know that a slide object was going to be my best bet for this situation, or how did I know that I need to put all those things in the list object? That's really the purpose of those videos, and I do kind of go over all of the properties of all of these things too, so even if you are a long-time ePrime user, there is a lot of value in these as well, because they might show you a property or how a property interacts with something that you might not have known before. So yeah, thank you guys very much. That's really all the content I have for today, so have a great day.